is a topic that is very, very interesting to me. I have had the chance to speak with a lot of people from low-income countries, and a lot of people really hold the idea that open access publication, for example, is just a scam. So every open access journal is just a predatory journal, and it's really, really hard to change their mind, and also to say that they're wrong. And so I'm really happy to hear an expert opinion on the matter. Tony Ross-Hellauer is the leader of the Open and Reproducible Research Group and a senior researcher at the Technical University of Graz and No Center. His research focuses on a range of issues related to open science evaluation, skills, policy, governance, monitoring, and infrastructure. And from January 2023, he will lead the new EC-funded project Tier 2 to increase reproducibility of research results. So thank you very much, Tony. May I call you Tony, for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes, of course. Everybody, please call me Tony. Hello, everybody. Thanks again to the organizers for the invitation. Although this is a reproducibility event, I won't be talking so much about reproducibility, but maybe because, as Francesco said, I've got this new project starting in January, and I'll kind of outline that at the end. Maybe when we move to discussion, maybe we can talk about what these themes that I talk about today mean for the debate on reproducibility more broadly. But the main topic of the talk today is dynamics of cumulative advantage and threats to equity in open environment. And the main idea is that open science, a key element of open science is democratizing access to knowledge and to knowledge creation. But that maybe some of the ways that we have implemented open science and are actually working against this aim. That's the kind of too long, don't read version. But the longer version, when we talk about open science, we're actually talking about a very diverse bunch of different practices, and they can be characterized as ways of opening up scientific processes and products from all levels to everyone, kind of a high level. But under that higher level, this is really only an umbrella for a bunch of very different things and very different concerns. So the idea of making all the publications that we write and publish open access, so that you don't need a subscription via the library, or you don't need to pay to access them. This is a very key aim. But then opening up the data that we produce in the course of our research is aligned with this aim, but operationally a very different set of issues. But we also want to open up the software as well as the code that we use to analyze, create this data. And we want to open it up as open source very often. We want, for reproducibility, we need to move towards systems where we share protocols, we pre-register results a lot earlier, that we share our methods and our materials to make sure that others can reproduce our work. A lot of people include the topic of citizen science under open science, and citizen science is, of course, the idea that we're opening up not only the processes, not only the products of science, but we're opening up who is able to participate in the creation of knowledge, and kind of trying to get away from this ivory tower aspect of academia and include broader populations in creation, analysis of data. And it's also about new ways of evaluating in a transparent way the research that we produce, as well as the ways that we ourselves as researchers are assessed. And one element of that, of course, is opening up the peer review process. These are all very different issues aligned around transparency, access, participation, of course, but operationally very different. And so underlying all of these practices are also a bunch of different principles or aims, things that we want to get out of pursuing these activities. So this is very old now, but I still use it just to show the range of issues that people, the range of things, benefits that people think we can derive from open science. And this was as the result of about 5 or 6 years ago, just asking on Twitter which aims or principles people thought that open science had. And you can see it's all good stuff: transparency, accountability, inclusivity, responsibility, rigor, equality, reproducibility, but also very diverse kind of principles or aims. And maybe if we want to get one of these things, then we might also then maybe we can't have all of them at 100% at the same time, and maybe there are trade-offs between them, and maybe the trade-offs that we decide to make in the course of implementing open science will have effects for the kind of open science that we end up with. And so this is kind of the broader underlying theme of my talk today. Of those principles, I mean, just to introduce a bit of autobiography. So I came, after my PhD, I was working kind of outside academia for a while, and then became very interested in the idea of open science, especially while I was still trying to write papers and didn't have access to a library anymore, and really felt kind of just how much of an outsider you can feel if you don't have access to the resources that kind of the university enables very often. So this fueled my kind of interest in open science, and then I worked within open science infrastructures at first, and then for the last few years I've kind of found my way back to research, and now it's research on open science. But for me, the themes of equity, inclusivity, and democratization of knowledge were really this is really why I'm super interested in implementing open science, because I think that it really is a progressive movement which could democratize our knowledge creation processes, but we have to do it right. And so just to say, these ideas were already baked in to open science, the aims of open science. So in the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which is like this key declaration that's 20 years old, which kind of kickstarted the open access movement, this is very utopian in language, talking about how enabling open access could share learning between rich and poor and lay the foundation for uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. There's a book called Reinventing Discovery by Michael Nielsen. If you haven't read it, I really advise that you do. It's a great book, but there's a whole chapter in that about the democratization of knowledge that can be brought by open science. And more recently, a couple of studies which have kind of looked at the key aims that people are looking for from open science. Equity, it appears as kind of one of the key benefits that we hope to derive from open science. But here we go. Yeah. When we talk about open science, we're talking about a bunch of different types of practices, which all are kind of fueled by a bunch of different types of aims and principles. And who is deciding on what that definition or the overriding aim of open science is? Open science can be defined in many different ways by different groups, and their agendas, I say here may not, but probably will not always converge. And here, let's think about researchers from different disciplines and different regions. A researcher in a humanities department is probably looking for very different things from open science than a researcher in a department for clinical medicine, let's say. And the issues around introducing open science are probably very different if we're sitting in Graz in Austria or Basel in Switzerland than if we are sitting in Delhi in India, let's say, or in Kenya in Africa. The levels of resources that people have, the extent to which kind of the underlying infrastructures are there for to enable open science. We probably have different views on what is what should be priorities, let's say. And these are very different from the priorities of research funders, who very often have to explain to their governments what return on investment they have and how efficient their research is. Different from research institutions, who are very often focused on their own institutional prestige. And all these agendas, of course, differ a lot from the agendas of publishers, and especially for-profit publishers. The agenda for them very often is the profit margin and maintaining what have been historically huge profit margins of like 30 to 40% in the case of the bigger publishers. And how do these different agendas then shape the outcomes, kind of the types of open science that we are led to implement? Uptake of open science also depends a lot on resources. It's not cheap, and you need a lot of different things: infrastructure, training, support, political will, and to state the obvious, access to resources across the world and across academia is not equally distributed. So there are structural inequalities within academia across regions and across demographics. So the global north still dominates. Global south research is still pushed to the periphery. Even within the richer regions, these notions of excellence often drive funding to kind of the already established centers. So there's kind of cumulative advantage in terms of accruing funding. There's issues, of course, of gender, as well as race, and other issues of inclusivity, equity, diversity. And as I said, funders are very often pushed to show return on investment, and this has kind of over the last decades privileged ever more the science, technology, engineering, maths, medicine fields, which can kind of directly show this return on investment very, very easily compared to the social sciences and humanities. And so there are structural inequalities, but there's also a dynamic called the Matthew effect. And so this was noticed by a sociologist called Robert Merton. And here the general idea is that the rich get richer, money makes money, let's say, in common parlance. And so if you're already successful, your chances of getting more success are much higher, basically. And these effects of cumulative advantage have been shown to be at play throughout academia at the level of journals. If you're a journal that's already very, very highly cited, a huge journal, a journal with a huge impact factor, then obviously more researchers want to publish there, and you're able to sort through and only take the things that you think will have the most citations, and therefore maintain this, this impact factor will increase. But it's also at the level of, as I said, of institutions and departments and countries. Individual attributes of researchers, including race and gender. So this Matthew effect applied to race is called the African Eve effect, and applied to gender, the Matilda effect. And this basically means that all other things being equal, if a man and a woman stand together in presentation of a scientific finding, the recognition will go to the man. And this is especially ironic because Robert Merton did a lot of the research that led to his kind of recognition of the Matthew effect actually came from the PhD thesis of his wife, who now whose name doesn't appear there. But this effect of cumulative advantage also appears across a range of scientific activities. If you already have a lot of citations, you get more citations. It's at the level of peer review, public engagement, and funding acquisition. So there are a lot of structural inequalities in academia, but there's also this mechanism which means that if you are already further ahead, it's a lot easier for you to make progress. And a key idea then for us, since equity is a key aim of open science, but science is unequal, and there are mechanisms which not only maintain that structural inequality, but fuel more inequality through Matthew effects and cumulative advantage, might open science be at risk in some cases of reinforcing existing privileges or creating new ones? The main idea being, we want open science to create a fairer, more just, more equitable world. At least I do. And if it's doing the opposite, this is bad, and we should find ways to mitigate that. So this was the main idea motivating a Horizon 2020 project called On Merit, which I was the principal investigator on from 2019 until March of this year. We were a group of 5 institutions using sociological, bibliometric, and computational approaches. And as I said, we want to look at the issues of equity in open science across a range of different issues. And the overall aim being to make sure that open science is on track to contribute to a more equitable scientific system, and to find that where it isn't on track there and create recommendations against that. So we've got a lot of results. The project finished in March, as I said, and these results have slowly started appearing in publications and will continue to do so. But we also produced recommendations. So across the whole project, we looked within academia, especially at effects of cumulative advantage in publishing, how resources relate to kind of success in open science, but we also looked at the links between the kind of the open science university and links with industry, to look at uptake of open science and kind of who is able to uptake open science in industry, but also the interface with policymaking. And this all led into synthesis and recommendations, which are available. I'll send these slides out, which can be shared, and I'll talk about those recommendations later. So the first thing we did, as usual, is a scoping review. So we looked at the literature. And so this has been online since the start of this year. And here we wanted to know what evidence and discourse exists in the literature about the ways in which dynamics and structures of inequality could persist or be exacerbated in the transition to open science. From synthesizing the literature, we actually found 268 relevant studies which talked about ways in which open science might be at threat of exacerbating inequalities. And amongst these threats, which are summed up in this paper, we talk about basically the costs of participation, about the more well-resourced you are and able to transition to open science, the further ahead you might be in an open science world, and the more that open science is expected in order to publish or to get funding, that this further advantages the already advantaged. I'll talk today a lot, in a while, I'll talk more about the way that we're implementing open access and the effects of this has on equity. There's the kind of cumulative nature of data inequalities. So with open data, we kind of think, well, if we enable access to data, then everybody has access to it. And this benefits everybody. And naively, we might think it benefits everyone equally. But of course, you've got to have the competences and the resources sometimes just in terms of computational power, as well as kind of the know-how to be able to make best use of that data. These competences and resources are not equally distributed, of course. And so there is some evidence that kind of open data maybe advantages global north actors a bit more than others. And here, for example, there was resistance. So sometimes there are centralized databases. These are very often hosted at kind of global north institutions. Researchers from the global south are encouraged to contribute to these databases, so that, like, to add their data to these sources, but then they don't want to, basically because then they think that the credit just goes to those hosting the databases. There's an issue of kind of what we call the platform logic of open science, which is an issue that we've got a lot on the internet, like just the platformization and kind of the walled gardens that this creates and how this might work against open science. There's a real issue with lack of reward structures for people who want to practice open science, and this might then work especially against early career researchers for whom kind of their years of productivity and kind of what they during PhD time, what they have to show for it in the end for on their CV really is crucial in terms of getting their next position. And so these are years when do I decide to just not care about open science and try to publish in the highest impact factor journals I can, because I know that that's what the people who will be assessing me want to see, versus do I try to do things right and focus more on process and making sure that all my research outputs are open. These are real core questions for people. And then there was an issue of exclusion of societal voices in citizen science research. So the kind of logics of participation, even amongst communities which might look like they're open to participation for everybody. I won't talk so much about that today, all in the scoping review. I will talk about a couple of things that we really looked at in depth. And the first I flagged, we talked about this issue of the way that we're implementing open access. So this is about out of order. There are lots of ways, there are a couple, well, two main ways to do open access, and then a lot of variants of those. But we could either just stick with the subscription system and then all self-archive our submitted manuscripts in institutional repositories, let's say author self-archive and green open access, or we could make all the journals that publish our research, make these fully open access, and this is called gold open access. With gold open access, a lot of you, I'm sure, are very familiar. One of the main ways to finance that is to charge authors, although usually it's not authors paying directly out their own pockets, of course, it's usually money coming from institutions or from funders, but to charge author-facing charges to publish in journals, APCs, article processing charges. But there's a problem here, and if we think about open access, the idea of open access to publications was to dismantle a barrier, the barrier to readership, which meant that many researchers in less well-resourced institutions, especially in the global south, who couldn't afford high subscription rates, they didn't have access to the knowledge. And this, of course, is a major barrier to their participation in kind of creating more knowledge. So we wanted to tear down this barrier to readership. But with the article processing charge model, of course, what we've done that by creating a new barrier to authorship. If you want to author in certain journals, which are open access and require an article processing charge to publish there, then there is this barrier to publication, even once you're accepted, which is that you have to pay some money. We know that resources are not equally distributed around the world, of course, and so the article processing charge model within open access publishing seems to discriminate against those with less resources. And we noticed there was at the start of our merit, there was one paper had just come out, which noticed that this seems to be having already effects of stratification in terms of who publishes where. So this paper from 2018 by Seiler et al. Showed that in the US, authors from higher ranked institutions publish APC OA more often, and that they pay higher article processing charges. Then since then, another couple of studies publishing OA with APCs is more likely for authors of male gender from prestigious institutions. And this was in the American context with previous federal US research funding and association with STEM fields. And then OA involving APCs is associated with lower geographic diversity of authors. So the APC OA landscape is more dominated by global North actors. And there could be a lot of founding factors here, of course. And so we conducted our own study. This is now available as a preprint. The lead author was our PhD student, Thomas, who did a great work, and he wrote the manuscript I supervised. So I'm really presenting kind of his work, some of my ideas, but his kind of hard work. So we investigated the relationship between proxies of institutional resourcing and average APCs on a global level. We looked at differences between fields and countries and changes over time. And we looked at 1.5 million journal articles to do this from a bunch of different data sources, which Thomas put together. And we showed that there is an association, strong association between institutional resources and average APCs. It's equally strong whether you consider the first or the last author, but this might be explained by other factors. There could be confounding factors here, like country or field, and so Thomas developed a Bayesian multi-level hurdle model to control for these effects of field and country, and found that nonetheless, even controlling for all these small to moderate effects of institutional resources on APCs in most fields, especially social sciences, some kind of inverse effects in mathematics, where better resource institutions publish more open access in journals with no APC, but the clear trend is more resources equals higher APCs paid, more and more OA, APC OA. So in summary, this research and the other research that I've shown shows that researchers from better resource institutions publish more APC-based OA and they pay higher APCs. The OA publishing involving APCs is creating a new barrier for who publishes where. And the implications for this, so obviously this is bad. Like we shouldn't have stratification in publishing in general. The idea is hopefully that we're a global research community and that we are in dialogue, that we're in a global conversation. We shouldn't be talking in different places, except maybe as regards where we shouldn't be talking in different places just because of levels of resources. And the implications for this, voices from societies and communities less embedded in global science, further marginalized. The global issues really need global perspectives. And if you think about the way that the European Commission, for example, is now increasingly funding research based on missions or kind of grand societal challenges, climate change, let's say, those conversations really need the whole global community contributing to them, because to put it bluntly, people from different parts of the world are aware of the local issues more, and those need to be heard in the conversation. And so the existing inequities are amplified here: citation advantage, future reward. There's citation advantage associated with open access that more or less stably shown across studies, and then future reward structures. A second example from On Merit is the example of reform of reward and recognition. Here I talked earlier about the fact that if you're not rewarded properly for for taking up open science practices, this can be a major incentive against doing so. And maybe even for some early career researchers who do decide I'm going to spend the time to do the work really well, that everything is very well documented and described and made available to ensure replicability, reproducibility, reusability of my research. The people who spend the time doing all this work might be disadvantaged compared to those who do it quite sloppily, but rush to get these kind of flashy results, which often get in the kind of higher impact journals. So the problem here, institutional processes for reward and recognition not only don't sufficiently support the uptake of open and responsible research, but often get in the way of them. And this disadvantages those who wish to take up these practices. So to look into this, we looked at the promotion, review, and tenure policies from institutions in 7 different countries. The 7 countries were chosen because of the language competences that we had within On Merit, but we tried to look not only to take kind of a more global view, so not only Europe, but also the United States, as well as Brazil and India. 107 institutions across 7 countries and a variety of policy documents from all these. And you'll see in the figure on the right, these were the kind of the percentages, the amount of time that we found these criteria present in those policies. Still a lot related to quantification, showing return on investment. So patents, very clear. Engagement with industry, very clear. Journal metrics, very highly mentioned, even though they're hugely discredited now, following the declaration on the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. Things like numbers of publications are still mentioned a lot. And then right at the bottom, of course, things which kind of progressive ideas like software, for example, although in Brazil this was found a lot, but nowhere else really. Ensuring gender balance of reviewers might be a good idea in terms of diversity, very rarely mentioned. And citizen science, open access, and open data are more or less completely absent. Open access and open data are not mentioned at all in the policies that we reviewed. And this isn't great, obviously, if we want to incentivize uptake of these practices. The institution, when it assesses the researchers, it should be assessing the whole researcher as somebody contributing, in my view, to the scientific community. And here we kind of followed this up by asking, with a survey of researchers, asking them what they value and what their institution values, to kind of further quantify what we think is a real mismatch. Because it's not the case that number of patents or number of or the journal impact factor is what really drives people and gets them out of bed to contribute to science in the morning, but they know that it's what their institution wants. So we wanted to quantify this mismatch. So we did this survey where we asked them, in your view, how important is this factor, or how important should this factor be in research assessment criteria? And then we asked them, in your perception, how important is that actually in the criteria of your university? So, bit of a disclaimer, this is their perception of the review, promotion, tenure criteria, not necessarily what the criteria actually are, but the kind of the ways in which this mismatch plays out is, I think, fascinating. So here we see the things which were kind of most valued, you'll see on the left, very important. And here the most valued things for both mentoring PhDs, postdocs, generating high quality publications. And this is great, obviously. We should be valuing these activities. But if you look at the top, we've ordered it here by kind of the mismatch. And the level of mismatch between more important to researchers at the top and more important to institutions at the bottom. So at the top, you'll see the biggest mismatch is between openly sharing research data, which is very highly valued, and less so by the institute, very highly valued by researchers and less so amongst institutions. Openly sharing research code or creating software, much more personally than by the institution. Things just like being collegial, helpful, and respectful, which I really think, I mean, obviously very undervalued traits in academia. Contributing to open peer review, openly sharing research articles. These are all perceived as undervalued by the institutions. And then at the bottom, you'll see what they think are, what our cohort of researchers thought were overvalued. And you'll see that it's publishing in highly regarded journals or conferences, receiving awards, publishing a large number of research articles, so just brute quantity of output with no regard to quality. And we saw from the last slide just how represented this criteria was, and then generating funding. So there it's like, these things are important, of course, bringing in money and writing research articles, but doing, like, creating quality work should be kind of what's most useful. And so we, from this, propose that we need to kind of rebalance research and assessment criteria to make sure that we're properly incentivizing researchers. So how could we improve? We had in the final stage of On Merit, we used a modified Delphi process. So this was rounds of kind of online workshopping to generate recommendations, and then rounds of anonymized surveys amongst our participants, kind of what they thought of the recommendations in order to kind of come to some consensus recommendations against these issues. We looked at 4 priority areas from across On Merit. That's just the general resource intensity of open research. We looked at article processing charges and the stratification of open access publishing, as I discussed. We looked at societal inclusion in research and policy making, and the reform of reward and recognition. So it's 2 of the issues that I had just talked about. On APCs, a lot more transparency is required from publishers on publication costs. The Nature journals have APCs of 11,000 euros now. And for some researchers, it's more than 2 or 3 or 4 months' salary. It's just ridiculous. It shouldn't cost that much. A lot of that is based on kind of the artificial scarcity. So Nature prides itself on rejecting like 94% of everything that's submitted. But a lot of it is just paying for the brand. You know, it's like paying for Gucci. You know that the shoes didn't cost that much to make. So more transparency on costs, support alternative publishing models, especially what's called diamond open access, where there are no author-facing charges, no readership charges, and that the kind of the funding model is that there's consortial funding. So the kind of universities and funders could all get together and just say, we will fund these platforms for publication, and we will make sure that they publish however many articles per year, and nobody would have to pay. Neither readers nor authors would have to pay. They should share infrastructure, open source publishing infrastructures. Yeah, and then on rewards and recognition, we don't just need new indicators to say how many open access articles did you have, or how much data did you share last year. These kind of extrinsic, I mean, this will help, but just doing that will make open science practices into kind of give it this extrinsic motivation. And I think that what we will see is just a lot of performative transparency, people just going through the motions. without really taking the time to incorporate open science practices properly. We need a bigger change in assessment cultures beyond quantitative indicators, to more value of quality, openness, collaboration, and responsibility. We need flexible assessment processes. We need to define kind of the aims of assessment collaboratively, share best practices, and make sure that career pathways are sustainable. Also for those in supporting roles for open science. You know, there's, for instance, the data stewards who are being it's a new role created to support research data management within universities. Very often these roles are just funded on project funding at the moment. What's the path to kind of a permanent employment, and kind of what's the career, what's the progression trajectory for those kind of careers which aren't necessarily research, but they're not administration, and they fall somewhere in between. Sometimes in the university it's too often either or. So this was on Merit, finished in March, and the next big adventure starting in January will be a €2 million project called Tier 2 that I will be principal investigator of. And this is to investigate reproducibility. Key theme here will be the idea of epistemic diversity and what that means for reproducibility. So epistemic diversity is the idea that the methodologies that we use across disciplines has very real implications for kind of the value of knowledge, or kind of what constitutes knowledge within different disciplines. And as refers to reproducibility, there are very real differences for what we might want or expect for reproducibility based on methodological things like in physics or in computer science, for instance, you can have very high control over research environments. But as soon as you move into the clinic and you're dealing with real life people who are moving around, or you're in psychology, or then even in social science, and you're dealing with issues of cognition or social dynamics, and so then the kind of control that you can have over the research environment becomes a lot less. There are much greater researcher degrees of freedom in kind of interpreting meaning, but also the extent to which fields rely on statistics for inference, the extent to which they can define their research aims in advance, and the extent to which they rely on the interpretation of researchers. If you think in philosophy, for example, this is a lot of interpretation. These all have big implications for what we might want reproducibility to be across different disciplines. And a lot of what we know, or the conversation about reproducibility, has been produced from this kind of narrow spectrum of behavioral, clinical, medical sciences, which have a very specific view on what knowledge generation is and how it's done. So we'll be, over the course of 3 years, involving research communities, publishers, and funders to create and evaluate new tools and practices for reproducibility. So just a brief call to get in touch. And then maybe we want to talk about the stuff from on merit and APCs. Maybe we want to talk about reward structures, but also just thinking in terms of equity and reproducibility. I think there are still themes here. Enabling, so on the right, this is the pyramid from Brian Nosek, and this is kind of levers for intervention that we need to kind of put in place to move towards open and reproducible research. We need to enable infrastructure to make it possible. We need to make sure that these infrastructures are supported by easy user interfaces and experiences, skills and training to make it easy for people to do things. We need communities taking these things up and to make these practices visible, to make these practices normative. We need to revise incentives to reward those things, and we need to put policies in place to require them. And none of this is cheap either, obviously, and kind of those with the money are further empowered. does this shift or kind of, could this be an issue within reproducibility? On the incentives, how to best reward and recognize reproducibility practices, especially important for you, early career researchers. And on epistemic diversity, maybe one question I mentioned to the organizers at the start, we have a reproducibility here in Graz, but it's mainly psychologists. How to diversify interest in the topic of reproducibility in these communities to beyond these kind of behavioral clinical sciences. Yeah, so these are just suggestions for things we could talk about, but I will now stop talking. I think I talked a lot longer than I said I would. I apologize for lying.